Estrogen is not the primary female hormone. It's a stress hormone. If there is such a thing as a primary female hormone, it's progesterone. Having children increases a woman's health.
Yeah, so that latter one, having children, increases a woman's health. Oh, just to remind people, so most of these, although I've added a few of my own today, originally come from tweets from a Twitter user, whose name I can't even pronounce, but we'll make sure we put the tweet underneath the episode again to give them credit for sparking the idea of doing these episodes. So yeah, what we're taught is that estrogen is the primary female hormone, that it's good, that the problems associated with menopause and even premenopause are mainly down to lack of estrogen, and that getting more estrogen is a good thing. We're taught that progesterone is kind of like a secondary irrelevant thing, and certainly something that's only relevant to women who are menstruating and nothing else. And Dr. Peat taught something so radically different from that it's worth exploring, especially because he's not like someone who is, no offense to these people, but who has channeled this information from fifth dimensional Atlantic aliens. He's actually doing it based on a vast amount of scientific literature which supports what he's saying, right? So these are not just ideas. There's actually a wealth of evidence that these things are 100% true, which for some reason never got caught on and suppressed and was suppressed. And it's easy to be conspiratorial about these things, and there may be conspiracy involved, but of course it may also just be error. People sometimes get things wrong. The wrong ideas catch on. This has happened throughout history. People have made mistakes, and once a mistake is ingrained, it's often very hard to change. As the famous physicist Robert Feynman said, I believe, if I'm quoting correctly, scientific progress usually happens one funeral at a time. Meaning that, once a scientist has got an idea in their head, usually you have to wait until that generation of scientists die and a new generation can come in and kind of replace it. Now, if you add to that the massive incentive of funding, both from corporations, both from business, but also funding from government that have their own agendas and that are much more intertwined than we would ideally like them to be, I think everyone would agree on that, then we can see where there's a lot of realm for error, where error can really take over. And of course, some of Dr. Ray Peat's ideas may be error, and we can't be sure about that, but I feel like it's worth at least exploring them. So yeah, on the subject of estrogen and progesterone, this is such a huge thing because, of course, this is something that women suffer with, certainly by the time they hit menopause. I think pretty much every woman suffers with menopause, and then they suffer from being postmenopausal. These days, more and more women are suffering even way before the menopause from all kinds of hormonal issues, whether it's PCOS, whether it's PMS, whether it's lack of fertility, all kinds of issues that may be down to this fundamental misunderstanding about the female hormones. So, as I said, there's two basic parts to what he was saying there. Number one, that estrogen is, although it serves a function and is necessary for childbirth and conception, that it's not good overall, that you would want to keep it as low as possible other than for that purpose. That's Ray Peat's the idea that he's putting forth. And then the other idea being that the main hormone that keeps women healthy and keeps women feeling good for as long as possible is actually progesterone. There's an extension to that, which is that it may also be key to men feeling good too. But the thing is that men also have testosterone and the metabolites of that, which we'll talk about later, which help them feel good. My understanding is in terms of hormones, really the primary hormone that makes a woman feel good is progesterone. So we'll get into that. We'll get into Ray Peat's quotes on that.
Perfect. Yeah, let's do this one. It says, in the 1930s, around the time that just before the polyunsaturated fats were discovered to be very toxic, estrogen was considered a toxic inflammation-promoting hormone. And it was only a huge propaganda campaign by the estrogen industry that created the idea that it's the female hormone.
And just remind the censors on whatever platform this is being watched on, we are quoting Ray Peat. This is not something that we were saying. But yeah, as I said, he totally saw this as an industry conspiring together to bring a certain idea into popular mainstream thought, which is in the 30s it was considered toxic and inflammation promoting, and they put a lot of work, as he'll describe in detail in this quote, into convincing the scientific establishment, the medical establishment, and then everyday people like you and me downstream of that actually it was a good thing.
Perfect. All right, here we go. Males, old men who are under stress, or younger men who had either a traumatic accident or is very sick, man's estrogen will rival the peak estrogen production of young women. So it's absolutely not a female hormone. It's just a stress-related or traumatic response hormone. It helps to renew cell production, which seems to be why it's associated with a traumatic injury. It has the effect of creating new cells. In the uterus, that's what it does. It causes uterine growth and preparation of a rapid multiplication of the lining of the uterus in preparation to receive the implanted embryo.
So it is something that leads to growth. And so that's why I said it's essential for the conception process. But you see, he's talking about the proliferation of cells. Well, what happens to the proliferation of cells, especially when they're, it's uncontrolled and mutated? Well, that's what we often refer to as, the T word, the C word, and that's, depending on the country, the number 1 or number 2 cause of death. So people who get really deep into understanding estrogen without bias, often that's one of the main things that they dislike about it. In fact, that's most commonly the main thing they dislike about it is this unrestrained multiplication of cells becoming potentially fatal.
Yes, he carries on to say, but that function is wound related. In effect, it creates a small injury reaction in the uterus to multiply cells, preparing it for the latter action of progesterone to mature the cells. And it was very early recognized to be interacting, causing the toxic effects of polyunsaturated fats to increase. And all of the effects of polyunsaturated fats were seen to be amplified by estrogen and vice versa.
Yeah, so Ray Peat is also one of the first people who brought into public consciousness the idea that polyunsaturated fats, especially omega-6 fats, or often called seed oils, are actually not beneficial for health at all. Although he's one of the first people to bring that idea back because, again, around that same time, around the 30s, they were considered to be highly toxic. And then there was, again, a big push, a big campaign led by seed oil industry, funnily enough, to see it as a healthy thing. So what he's talking about there is the two make each other worse. If you have estrogen and no polyunsaturated fats, you're in a much better position. Or if you have polyunsaturated fats but very low estrogen, you're in a much better position. The two will feed into each other and make the effects of each much worse.
Right. It's kind of like kindling. It's just going to, spark more flames.
Yes. Yep.
He carries on. Stress increases your estrogen to progesterone ratio, and you experience stress more easily when something is interfering with progesterone production. Most often, low thyroid is responsible because thyroid and estrogen are inversely related. If a woman takes as much thyroid hormone as makes them feel just right, maximally efficient, they might reduce their menstruation to the extent that they don't even know they're cycling. But there is such a close inverse relationship between thyroid and estrogen. You can pretty much control your estrogen level by adjusting your thyroid.
So thyroid is something we talked a lot about in the last episode in terms of Ray Peat's view on it, and it's something I've talked about in several episodes before as well. Ray Peat was a huge proponent of adding thyroid. As we talked about in the last episode, he believed that actually, until it was made illegal in most Western countries, everyone would be naturally supplementing thyroid in the foods they ate when they ate, the whole chicken in the soup or a whole fish in the soup or whatever. There's always some thyroid hormone coming from the animal into the food. And of course, it can very well be taken up orally, which is why, tablets are what are given to this day. So from his perspective, there are many reasons for it, but one of the reasons why we're so unhealthy is because we have that lack of thyroid. And so many things that he talks about that are toxic and bad for us, like two we just mentioned, excess estrogen or polyunsaturated fats. If we had enough thyroid, they'd be a lot less bad for us. And so he's giving an example there about how thyroid can help with that excess estrogen.
He carries on. And when you're under stress, you suppress your thyroid function, and so your estrogen rises. And estrogen, by creating inflammation and inefficient metabolism in the uterus, causes reduced... Sorry, I think there might be a misprint in here. Yeah. I'll carry on. The estrogen is washing both glucose and oxygen, and so it's starving the tissues and will cause miscarriage because it kills the embryo and causes inflammation and contraction of the uterus. So it both damages the embryo and tends to expel it prematurely. And thyroid is the basic thing to lower the estrogen. Get your progesterone back up so that it is anti-inflammatory, relaxes the uterus, and protects the embryo. So there's a lot going on in here.
Yeah, Dr. Peat actually spent a long time looking into pregnancy, what's involved in a healthy pregnancy, what's involved in a unhealthy pregnancy. He wasn't just focused on, how to help women be healthier, how to help people be healthier. He's specifically focusing on that aspect of it, how to give birth to a healthy child in the first place, what stops that happening, what increases the chance of that happening. Is that clear, Chrissy? Do we need to break that down at all?
I'd like to break it down a little bit there. Yeah, absolutely. Because there's this, one, they're inversely related. Yeah, let's go into it a little bit more, because I know that there's a lot of women out there, and quite a few people I know that have had miscarriages along the way and not quite understanding it, especially the balance within the hormone cycle. So yeah, let's get into it a little bit.
So in a nutshell, what Dr. Peat is saying here is that estrogen is highly inflammatory, and the worst thing about it that he's just said there, from his perspective, is that it makes the metabolism less efficient. Metabolism, if there was one word that really defined Dr. Peat's teachings to me, as I understand it, it is metabolism. Everything that he looked at is, improving metabolism is good, and everything that slows down or makes metabolism less efficient is bad. He looked at it from that perspective. And so what he's saying there is that estrogen, because of that inflammatory metabolism damaging quality, if it's excessive in relation to progesterone, and we'll talk about progesterone next, can often lead to miscarriage. And so he's saying higher thyroid and higher progesterone in relation to estrogen will protect the baby, prevent miscarriage, and the opposite will do the opposite.
He does talk a lot about stress, and that estrogen rises with stress. But let's say somebody's not stressed, but maybe they have a high estrogen. I mean, how can they tell if that, where that ratio or that balance is coming in, especially if they're having miscarriages or things like that? What would be the next step?
Well, so that's interesting. And again, so I think most people, as I said, who research estrogen honestly will come to the conclusion that it's not good to have it high. Dr. Peat was more unusual in his evaluation of estrogen, though, because he firmly, squarely, as we said in the quote, sees it as a stress hormone. So meaning you don't actually have high estrogen without having stress, from his point of view. So because yes, stress leads to high estrogen, but conversely, high estrogen creates stress by creating inflammation, by lowering thyroid hormone, like it said earlier, as we've talked about a lot when we talk about thyroid. If your body is not producing enough energy through thyroid stoking the metabolism enough, then it has to use the backup system, which is stress. So we could say increased estrogen will increase inflammation, will reduce thyroid function. Reduced thyroid function means the stress chemicals have to go up. So yeah, from his point of view, there would not be a situation where you're not stressed and your estrogen is high.
And those things, so we were looking at biochemical stress, not necessarily external. I mean, yeah, you could still have the external trauma stress that's coming in and causing that stress, but there's internal biochemical stress that's going on within the system, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we talked about this recently. Maybe it was not in the very Peat episode, but how does a person know if they're stressed or not, right? And it's actually not an easy question to answer, because people adapt to not only very awful situations often and consider it normal, but in the same way that a person who's brought in a situation of abuse and torment and trauma and rape and the worst horrific things, especially if that's everyone around them is also going through that, we'll consider that to be normal on a very deep level. So if you've got none of that horrible stuff going on to you externally, but you have an internal environment which is horrific and traumatic and turmoil inducing and all the rest of it, even if the outside world looks like a Disney movie, you'll still feel terrible if that's what's going on inside you. And again, you can adapt to that and think of that as completely normal. And so the other reason why high estrogen always correlates with stress, from Dr. Peat's point of view, I used thyroid as one example, but the other example that he already just mentioned that's huge is progesterone, which we'll talk about soon. But one of the main things that progesterone does is to reduce stress. And so if you have high estrogen in relation to progesterone, the estrogen suppresses the progesterone. He was just saying that in the quote as well. And so your anti-stress hormone is being suppressed, and so you're going to experience stress. Now, I think he was also of the perspective that I am, that although some of this is lifestyle, a lot of it is genetic. So people are just born with high estrogen, often called estrogen dominance, and low progesterone. We talked about this a bit when I did the interview with Dr. Michael Platt a few episodes ago. So you can go into that if you want to hear a little bit more about that from someone other than me. But that is another, significant factor. So a person could be born, and so for instance, if you had a difficult birth, if, your mother miscarried before they, managed to have you, if you had colic when you were first born, if your mother had postpartum depression when you were first born, if your mother struggled to get pregnant before you were born, all of these things are indicators from the perspective that your mother was estrogen dominant, maybe your father as well. And then if both of your parents, but of course the mother's more key in this scenario, and then if your parents, especially your mother, was estrogen dominant, then there's a good chance that you are. And if both your parents were, you definitely will be. And so then you will have this stressed, more easily overwhelmed, less resilient, more reactive, less able to just really relax and be present. It doesn't always show up negatively. You might be a super high achiever, type A kind of person, but even if you're very successful in the world, it often will show up as some kind of health issue, whether it's allergies, intolerances, digestive issues. These are like some of the most common early manifestations, maybe chronic infections. So these are all like indicators that you may be having stress, even though you don't even realize it. And it's only when you start to shift that by following the advice of people like Dr. Peat, to a degree, or me, or Dr. Platt, or whoever, who are teaching us how to get out of this state of running on high stress chemicals and into the state of running on high ATP, a good metabolism, then we can start to actually feel what it's like not to be stressed. So it's a tricky one. The test that I gave last time that I'll just briefly mention again is, are you able to sit still with no input, maybe like a blindfold thing and headphones without any sound, and just be present for 20 minutes without feeling in any way either agitated or exhausted? Can you just be present for a period of time? Most people cannot. And that's not a knock on them. That's not saying they're lacking discipline or anything. That's saying that they're in a horrible situation of chronic stress, maybe often without even realizing it. And so, but it's possible to escape from that. And it's hard to believe that. I mean, for me, I had it my whole life. My parents did, everyone in my family, the friends I tended to be around, like everyone is in a state of stress. And often, with that stress, there's drama and there's overwhelm and there's, emotional reactivity, and there's not a lot of centered calmness, and there's not a lot of joy, and there's not a lot of, inner peace. But all of that's possible. And although learning to think differently and relate differently and all that kind of stuff is very important and helps with that, and can even help a lot, especially if the person's very disciplined with it, I found that shifting what we're talking about here, the fundamental balance of hormones and neurotransmitters, and going from inflammatory to not inflammatory, and basic stuff like that, going from glycolysis to oxidative phosphorylation, which is basically like where your body is good at creating lots of ATP out of the food you eat, will just shift everything.
Yeah, you make some really valid, great points there, because I remember looking at some things that this was a new thing for me. Like, yes, there's the Krebs cycle where your ATP is coming, but then there's also something called the Cori cycle, which is that when you're creating your ATP out of stress, you're actually creating it from a deficit. So no wonder everyone's fatigued. Everybody's here because when they're trying to make the ATP that way, there's just not enough. It's never enough. So it's
never enough.
Yeah. No, but it's great that you say that there is a way to get beyond it. So I love that. And I love this. else.
But if it's a habit that isn't just like the last few years of your life, we're talking about a habit that probably goes back many, many generations. So this is the thing when people, you know, they take one supplement or like, you know, start adding one food in or something and they're like, well, I'm not better, it doesn't work. It's like, I'm not trying to make excuses. Like, you should actually be able to feel really differently after a, you know, relatively short period of time if you really do everything that I suggest. But it's still, you got to understand the amount of entropy, the amount of momentum that you are trying to change, right? The momentum is very much to be in a stress state, and also, you know, by that time it is also a neurological habit to be in a stress state. You know, it's very easy to go down that neurological pathway of reactivity rather than being present and open, like when a dog barks during a podcast.
Can't control it. So he goes on to say with the next quote, he says, my dissertation advisor did research testing the effect of just a little bit extra estrogen on animals that had been fertilized. At the first week when they were ready to implant the embryo, just the tiniest bit of extra estrogen caused them not to implant the embryo. The second week when it was implanted, it took just a little more estrogen and they would kill the embryo and expel it. Each week of advanced development of the embryo. It just took a little more estrogen added to kill the embryo and cause miscarriage. And that was in the 1950s, but that was already known that estrogen causes miscarriage in the 1930s. And despite that knowledge, the estrogen industry managed to convince the world that estrogen was not only the female hormone, but was helpful for pregnancy and preventing miscarriages.
I won't say much about that section, except for I know it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that they would do a bunch of research on a hormone, find that it causes miscarriages, and then give it to women to prevent miscarriages. And so that, I've often said, like, in the crazy world that we currently live in, people who have bad parents are actually at an advantage because we kind of instinctively don't trust authority. So I understand if you've had, like, you know, really wonderful authority figures in your life, it can be really hard to imagine, why would they do such a thing? That can't be true, you know? And so I don't expect you to believe me or Dr. Ray Peat, but if you're really interested in finding out what is going on with your body or maybe someone you care about, and just be open to this and look it up yourself, see if it's true.
Yeah, it's, I mean, looking at it from, and I you know, just a different perspective. What if, you know, it's like it's trying to disprove it. Well, what if estrogen is a stress hormone? What if it does this, you know, and then delve deeper into it, because as well, it's been told to us, or it's been the understanding in mainstream for so long that this is it. And then these new theories come along, and instead of just going, well, now, whatever, you know, like that's like, well, what if? So let me look at it. Let me delve into it. That's why I love what we're doing here today. This is really great, because as well, if that is the case, and if so many women are doing all these things and all this other stuff, then it makes sense. It's like, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's the key. Maybe that's the thing.
Yeah. There's that famous quote attributed to Einstein, but I don't know if it's him, of like, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same things over and over again, expecting a different result. Well, I think one of the interesting things that I see starting to come into collective consciousness, like even the mainstream, very recently, maybe just in the last year, is this idea of, why is there an explosion of chronic disease? Like, why have so many people got chronic diseases and at a younger and younger age? And they want to blame various different factors, and some of them we can't talk about on YouTube. And there may be a degree of validity to all of them. We talked about one in the last episode a lot, which is, you know, that there was an explosion of unsaturated fat use, right? In, you know, starting in the 1980s, which correlated very nicely with that explosion of chronic diseases. I'm sure there were other factors involved as well. And, you know, here we're talking about another one. There was an explosion of estrogen use around, you know, the 1960s, which I think the next part of the quote will go into, which probably wasn't great. So yeah, let's go into it.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I'll go into it. So they sold DES, I'm going to get this wrong, diethylstilbestrol. Correct me if that's incorrect.
I think that was a really good pronunciation. Yeah, so that's, yeah, synthetic estrogen.
Until in the 1950s, they were selling it with support from Harvard Medical School and the FDA and so on, selling it to prevent miscarriages. Then with the development of birth control pills, it finally came out that DES was causing cancer and not at all preventing miscarriages, but tending to create miscarriages. So the whole medical establishment was lied to. Hundreds, thousands of lying publications in all the best medical journals, saying such things as estrogen prevents miscarriages, prevents cancer, prevents epilepsy. Everything that they claimed that estrogen did for benefit, it turned out estrogen was causing the disease rather than preventing it. That just breaks my heart.
Yeah, and of course, that is the main way that a whole generation of women were given constant supplemental estrogen, is through the birth control pill. And the birth control pill was obviously empowering in some ways, because it meant that women could choose when they wanted to be pregnant to a much greater degree than ever before. And I genuinely think that is a good thing. You could say it's had some negative effects on society, but I think freedom and choice are, fundamental to a good society. So I think that was great in theory. The problem was that the mechanism that they used to make that happen was a thing that was perhaps, as we're learning here, something that is a poison to the body, something that, and the birth rates have been going down for many generations. And it's a concern now among a lot of people. A lot of the turmoil that's going on geopolitically is all down to birth rate kind of panic, where a lot of countries, their population, they're going to have more and more old people and less young people to replace them. And the whole economic system is dependent on that not happening. And it's a whole thing. And again, estrogen isn't the only thing. I think lack of thyroid is another thing we've really talked about. Too much seed oil is another thing we've really talked about. There's a bunch of other stuff as well. But it's contributing to that issue. And as this particular thing, estrogen directly, as he just talked about, can reduce fertility, increase miscarriages. It's significant.
Very significant. And it's just also goes into feeding into what you thought was the truth, and then having to go through the process, like you were just saying earlier, of going, oh, wait a minute. They knew that, but yet they said that, and now look at the effects it's had on my body. Like, what does somebody do with that?
Yeah. Well, there is a good news, which is the quotes that we're about to give. So I'm not into one of those podcasts who talks a lot about the horrible things that different, governments and companies have done to screw us over, and then just go, yeah, it's bad, isn't it? Like at the end of it, that's not what we're here for. So if we're telling you something's terrible, you can bet that we're going to, offer you something that will actually help with that. So that brings us nicely to what Ray Peat, as I said, if any hormone is the female hormone, and I don't think he would consider it either, because he also recommended it in men, although he personally recommended men have much lower doses than women, which is different from what Dr. Michael Platt recommends. But anyway, progesterone is miraculous in general, according to Dr. Peat and many other people. And again, countless studies. The amount of studies that say that, I don't know, any vitamin is good for you or any herb or whatever, are so much less than the studies that say that like thyroid is good for you or that progesterone is good for you or that estrogen is bad for you. And yet for some reason, which we could get conspiratorial about, that's ignored. So yeah, let's talk about the miracle of progesterone.
Absolutely. He said, if you think of estrogen as doing everything that tends to excite the cell and move it to a lower non-oxidizing energy system, progesterone knocks out those effects of estrogen and gets the cell back on the oxidizing pathway.
Which from his perspective is a good thing. Oxidizing, let's just say simply, it's a way that your body is able to produce a lot more ATP, a lot more energy from a unit of glucose, which is food, rather than struggling to make energy.
Perfect. He carries on to say, each of the steroids has a range of properties, and aldosterone has its estrogen resembling and anti-androgenic properties. Each one has a range. And it just turns out that progesterone will fill in for a deficiency of aldosterone or cortisol or androgen, but it will also protect against an excess toxic dose of those same things because it has a weak mineral corticoid effect that makes up for the absence of aldosterone as well as toxic excess.
Yeah, so let me try and break that down a little bit. So he's saying, I think it is a different quote. I don't know if we got it down here. I don't think we do. That one of the most amazing things about progesterone is that it has the ability both to substitute for the benefits of almost every other hormone. I'm pretty sure in a different quote he said the only two hormones that it can't make up for a lack of is testosterone and estrogen. but all the out the steroid hormones, but all the others like aldosterone, cortisol, DHEA, these super important hormones. It can, if you literally remove them, like he gave an example of animals that have adrenal glands removed, they can still function just fine if you give them enough progesterone. It will make up for a lack of all of those things, which is pretty amazing.
That is pretty amazing.
Yeah. And so, but he's saying not only can it make up for a lack of those things, but it can also actually help if you have far too much of those things. So it helps in both directions.
Which is interesting because usually, or at least my understanding is that usually when you're taking something that the body makes, then the body makes less of it. So you're not saying, so progesterone doesn't do that.
Well, I think in the case of, say, cortisol, it would. So if you're producing a lot of cortisol, then you're adding progesterone in, your body will make less cortisol. Same with aldosterone. Aldosterone is one of the things that can lead to hypertension. It causes the blood vessels to contract. So it's one of the culprits with high blood pressure, which of course is one of the main things that can lead to cardiovascular disease. So it's very, very beneficial in that it can downregulate the production to some of those things if they are excessive. And yet, on the other hand, I guess if you already have a very low level of something like aldosterone or cortisol or DHEA, then adding in the progesterone, it certainly won't reduce the production of those things, and it might actually increase it because it will bring the organism back to a state of health to the point where it can then start to make its own. Obviously not if the adrenal glands are removed, but if they're just not functioning correctly.
Yeah, that's what I was more referring to, because it's like maybe, and I may be wrong, so please correct me. It's like if somebody is taking testosterone, then their body will make less of it, or it's just that then they may have to continue taking it or things like that. But what I'm hearing from you is progesterone, as much as you take, it's not going to stop the body's ability to make it or enhance helping other hormones to get into balance. Yeah,
it doesn't seem to be downregulating. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's allowed to be sold as a dietary supplement, at least in the US. So the reason why testosterone is probably rightly, strictly controlled and sold only, with a prescription from a doctor, and similarly for thyroid in most countries, is because with either of those things, two things. First of all, if you take an overdose, like if you take 10 times as much progesterone as you should, it's not a good idea, but you won't have to be rushed to the emergency room. If you take 10 times as much testosterone or thyroid as you should, you probably do have to go and see a medical professional, right? Like it's a real issue. Second of all, with the progesterone. Now, there is a bit of a thing where the liver gets more efficient at clearing the progesterone, but there's absolutely not a thing where your body will stop making its own progesterone, which does happen with testosterone, where the testicles shrink when people take TRT, testosterone replacement, and basically they stop making their own testosterone. That happens with thyroid as well, to some degree, although Ray Peat was of the opinion that the thyroid can bounce back very quickly. His experience was that within a few days, it can go right back to making as much as it was before. I think most medical doctors would say it's probably take a few months, not a few days. But in either case, it's something that can be recovered from. But there's that downregulation, which doesn't happen with progesterone anywhere near as much, or at all, depending on the situation.
Perfect. Great. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. He goes on to say, and the same thing, testosterone has progesterone-sustaining, pregnancy-sustaining effects if you give it to a pregnant animal, but it's not nearly as effective at that purpose as progesterone. And the estrogen is the thing that it's strictly antagonistic to. It will have some of the anti-inflammatory properties of cortisol, as well as being a major protector against excess cortisol poisoning. And it does a lot of those things on the enzyme level as well as the so-called receptor level. When you look at a list of its actions, coordinated effects on both receptors of all sorts and enzyme activation changes, you would think it was a magical invention. It's so extremely complex, but organized.
And so remember, this was not something, unlike some of the other theories that we'll put in there, this was not something that Dr. Peat had a casual interest in over the course of maybe years. This was really his life work. He's a professor that taught at a lot of top universities, and studying progesterone and teaching about progesterone is really one of his things. And he considered it literally a magic wand almost for health, just an incredible thing for restoring health, even in people who are very sick. if given, in sufficient quantities, because of these effects of being able to recover from the damage of things like estrogen and cortisol, which each of them, in excess can kill you. Like, they're that bad.
I mean, it really is coming across as it's a pretty perfect thing that we should all really have in quite good quantity. It's, yeah, the more we're looking at it, the more I'm hearing about it. It sounds like, yeah, I love what he said. It's so extremely complex, but organized and does so many incredible things.
I think we had a quote in the previous quotes episode where he basically stated that pregnenolone, which is the steroid precursor to all the other ones, but often is the precursor to progesterone, and progesterone were like able to heal almost everything if given in sufficient quantities, and had been suppressed by the pharmaceutical industry for that reason. I'm not saying that, of course, but that is exactly what he said. I thought I'd just repeat that, paraphrase that quote again. And it's something that's worth considering. Now, of course, with progesterone, if you look it up, you'll see that it's bad for you, generally, if you Google it. And so one of the reasons for that is, of course, bias. But another one is that the type of progesterone that they're talking about is not the type that we're talking about. So the type of progesterone we're talking about is bioidentical progesterone, which is either the stuff that your body creates or something that's exactly the same as your body creates. The type of progesterone that they sometimes give women, so some birth control pills contain only synthetic estrogen, but some birth control pills contain synthetic estrogen and synthetic progesterone. That synthetic progesterone is actually really bad news and has a lot of the opposite effects of all the stuff we've just been saying about progesterone. And so often when you look up, progesterone for this, progesterone for that, it will say it's bad for you. But if you look carefully, they're usually not referring to the bioidentical ones.
And what's the how is bioidentical progesterone made?
From yam.
Okay, you're right.
Root vegetable. Yeah, it's just containing the root vegetable. So it's a very cheap, quick, easy, and of course non-patentable, which is the real issue, thing that anyone can make.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. He carries on in this one here. Catherine Daltrin in the 40s and 50s was treating premenstrual syndrome patients and menopause patients, but she had lots of patients suffering from poor nutrition who also had TMS problems. And over the years, she was giving them progesterone injections. And after several years of having treated them just for their current symptoms, someone said, "It's interesting that your patients' babies are so superior intellectually." And Dalton said that seems unlikely because their women with PMS are likely to have pregnancy problems, premature deliveries, and stressed pregnancies. And it's known that their babies average a few points below normal IQs. And so she doubted that person was right in saying that their babies were superior. So she studied it and found that all of the progesterone babies were academically superior, just like the chickens that had better brains for being exposed to the protective metabolic regulator. And I think she said that they were typically around 130 IQs instead of 96 IQs as their older siblings untreated with progesterone. So it was about a 34-point improvement in IQ just for that one addition. She didn't pay attention to their thyroid or protein intake or salt intake or any of the other factors.
So this is mind-blowing, if true. And again, as I said, this is not an opinion. This is not channeled from Atlantis. This is science. And so the science is that, yeah, this is what was discovered. Now, okay, 34 points of IQ. Let me put that into comparison. That's called more than 2 standard deviations. So 30 points IQ increase can take you from someone who is so mentally disabled they're unable to look after themselves without full-time care to someone who is completely average intelligence. Or 30-point IQ intake could take you from someone who is completely average intelligence to an actual genius. That's the difference that it makes. It's an extraordinary increase of IQ. And as he says, that's without sorting all the other problems that many of those women probably had. Malnutrition, lack of thyroid hormone. That was just one variable. So the fact that that variable has such a huge effect. IQ is an extremely controversial thing to talk about at all, so I will not go into it too much. But I'll just point out a couple of facts, which is, so first of all, IQ is the #1 predictor of success in life when we're talking about finances and career. There's this general idea that your success is probably mainly based on, whether you had rich parents, whether you had successful parents, what school you go to. And there's a lot of evidence that makes that seem to be true. But actually, if you look into the data, if you had the choice between being born into a very privileged upbringing with, rich, successful parents, sending you to a private school, sending you to Eton or Harvard or whatever, and having an average IQ, or having like 130 IQ and being born into a completely normal, working class household with normal parents who couldn't afford to send you to fancy school, you just went to a normal state school and all the rest of it, you are actually statistically more likely to be successful with 130 IQ than with all the privileges of wealth and status and social circle and all the rest of it. IQ is the biggest predictor of success. It's actually also one of the biggest predictors of success when it comes to health. It's one of the best predictors of longevity. So, whenever you say this to people, they say, well, I know really smart people who are really stupid. And I'd say, yes, absolutely true. Me too. I used to hang around with a lot of them. And they were, dead broke, criminals, drug addicts, and they were really, really smart IQ people. So, and arguably we could say I was one of them in my early 20s. So maybe not really smart, but the rest of those descriptions. So absolutely. High IQ does not guarantee making wise decisions. It does not equal success. It does not equal health. It does not equal longevity necessarily. However, low IQ makes it very, very, very difficult to be highly successful. And low IQ makes it very, very difficult to actually have a very long-lived life as well.
What aspect or mechanism that progesterone is creating in the environment do you think is allowing for that?
I don't understand this as much as Dr. Peat does, so I definitely recommend people to look into his work of it to understand it better. But my understanding is, so we think of progesterone as a sex hormone because it's primarily produced in that area. But one of the areas that has the biggest impacts on that Dr. Peat talks about a lot is actually the brain. So there's something about how it stimulates, the production of brain neuron growth. But I think the main way that it does it is because it's protective. It's protective from inflammation. It's protective from excess estrogen. It's protective from too much cortisol. It's protective from a lack of blood flow caused by too much aldosterone. It's protective of all the things that might otherwise retard the optimal growth of the brain. So I think it's less that it's like super brain juice, and it's more that it's like super brain protector shield. That's probably more the way of looking at it. That we would all be geniuses if only, we weren't being ravaged by too much inflammation, lack of nutrition, too much toxicity, maybe lack of oxygen, lack of this, lack of that. And so progesterone just helps to protect from all of those negative circumstances to a large degree. The exact mechanism that comes to that, Chrissy, if you're about to ask me that, no. We've already read out a few of them, right? But it gets really deep and really complicated. Dr. P is someone who will explain it in great detail. He's got a wealth of articles on his website, which someone else is still keeping going, and you can really get into it very deeply. And he gives huge amounts again of scientific references for all these points he's making. He doesn't expect you to take his word for it.
That's great. Now, this has been a fantastic section. I know for the things that we've been doing to prepare for the Dr. Michael Platt episode, the things that you've been sharing with me to prepare for this episode, I've been finding this absolutely fascinating, and changes that I've been implementing are very, very interesting. It's really just shifted a way I think about the hormones and things like that. So I do thank you for that, for sure.
My pleasure. And I'll say, I heard about thyroid before Dr. Peat, although everything that he says, agrees with it. But I probably really got into progesterone first by listening to Dr. Peat. And those two things together, I do believe has the miraculous healing effect that he talks about, like life-transforming effect. Does it happen overnight? Again, depends how much of a mess you are to start with, but I think it's 100% valid from my own personal experience. I'll just share that.
Did you mean by listening to Dr. Platt, you got into progesterone first?
No, Dr. Peat.
No, Dr. Peat. Okay, yeah, sorry, because Dr. Platt was my first introduction to progesterone.
Dr. Platt told me how much it's possible to take,
Right.
but I would not have been open to it even being a good thing without having read a lot of Dr. Peat's work first. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Rejuvenate podcast. If you want to watch the full episode that came from, just click on the link above. Or if you just want to watch our latest video, then click the link below. And make sure that you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you.